Workers couldn't move the old statue, but when a crane lifted it, authorities shut down the forest. The small group of workers gathered early in the morning, ready to face the challenge ahead. The dense forest stretched out before them, its tall trees whispering in the wind. They had been sent here on a mission that had been discussed for weeks, to move an ancient statue from its resting place deep in the heart of the forest to a nearby museum. The statue, covered in moss and dirt, had been discovered by a group of researchers who believed it held great historical value. It was old, mysterious, and said to be centuries, if not millennia, old. The team, a mix of experienced workers and a few curious newcomers, had been briefed on the importance of the statue. They were to carefully relocate it without damaging it or disturbing its surroundings. The task seemed simple enough, or so they thought. The statue itself was large, a dark stone figure carved into an unknown shape, standing tall in the middle of an overgrown clearing. It was impressive but weathered, showing signs of time's cruel touch. Yet there was something about it that made the workers pause. Perhaps it was the way it stood, almost as if it were alive, staring at them with its ancient, almost lifelike features. The workers quickly realized, however, that moving the statue wouldn't be as easy as they had hoped. They had a few tools with them, ropes, a few crowbars, and manual pulleys. But despite their best efforts, the statue would not move. They tried tugging, pushing, and even digging around its base, hoping to loosen it. But it felt as if the earth itself had claimed it, as though the statue was fused with the ground. The workers became more frustrated with each passing hour. It should have been a simple job, yet the statue remained stubbornly rooted in place. One of the workers, Marco, wiped sweat from his brow, his muscles aching from trying to pull the statue. He glanced around, noticing that even the trees seemed to watch them, standing still and silent. "Maybe we're not doing it right," he muttered, looking over at his colleague, Tina, who was trying to lift a large rock from around the base. Tina, the most experienced among them, didn't seem bothered by the statue's refusal to move. Instead, she squatted down and examined the area more closely. "There's something strange about this," she said, running her fingers over the stone. She had worked on various projects over the years, but this one felt different. Something about the statue's energy made her uneasy. It wasn't just old, it felt ancient and somehow powerful. Marco raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" Tina didn't respond immediately. She ran her hand along the base of the statue, noticing the grooves in the stone, the weathered texture of its surface, and the faint carvings she hadn't seen earlier. There was a pattern, almost like a language, etched into the stone, but it was worn down, faded over time. "I don't know. I think there's more to this statue than we think," she muttered, stepping back. "I don't think it's meant to be moved." The air around them seemed to thicken as they continued to struggle. The workers, sensing the unease, grew more agitated. They were tired, the sun was high, and they had been trying for hours to move the statue without any success. Marco suggested they take a break, but Tina refused to stop. She wasn't going to give up until they figured out why this statue wouldn't budge. "Let's try a few more things," Tina said, her voice steady but serious. "Maybe there's something we're missing." The team tried pulling again, this time using a combination of pulleys and ropes. But no matter what they did, the statue stayed in place, as if it were rooted deep into the earth. Marco began to grow impatient, a wave of frustration washing over him. "We've been at this for hours and we're getting nowhere. Maybe we need a bigger crew or even a machine." Tina looked at him, her face unreadable. "I think you're right. Maybe we need something more powerful to help us." After some discussion, the workers decided to bring in a crane. It was a last-ditch effort, but they were desperate. The crane was powerful, capable of lifting heavy objects, and it would be their best bet to get the statue out of the ground. But as they started to prepare for the crane's arrival, the workers couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The statue standing tall in the middle of the forest felt different than it had before. It almost felt like it was watching them. The trees, too, seemed to loom larger, their branches creaking in the wind as though they were whispering secrets. The forest was old, ancient even. It had been around for centuries, and while the workers had been told it was just a typical piece of history, the unease that settled in the air told a different story. There was something more to this place, something hidden within the shadows of the towering trees. Tina shivered despite the warmth of the day. She pushed the feeling aside, telling herself that it was just the stress of the job getting to her. After all, they were on a tight schedule. The statue had to be moved, and the crane was their best chance of getting it done. As the workers waited for the crane to arrive, they noticed something strange. The birds, which had been singing earlier in the day, had gone silent. The usual sounds of the forest had quieted, leaving only the soft rustle of leaves in the wind. It was as though the entire forest was holding its breath. Then, the low rumble of the crane's engine broke the silence. The massive machine slowly made its way into the clearing, its giant arms stretching out toward the statue. The workers gathered around, their curiosity piqued, their hopes rising that this would finally be the moment they could move the statue. The tension in the air was palpable, and even Tina, who had been so determined, found herself glancing nervously at the trees. The crane's arm creaked and groaned as it extended toward the ancient statue. The workers watched with bated breath. This was it. The machine's claw would wrap around the statue, and with one smooth motion they would finally lift it from its resting place. Or so they hoped. But as the crane's massive arm inched closer to the statue, something strange happened. A low, almost imperceptible vibration rippled through the air, as if the earth itself were responding. The workers looked at each other in confusion, unsure of what they were feeling. They had no idea that this was just the beginning of something far beyond their understanding. The giant crane towered over the clearing, its massive arm extending toward the ancient statue. Its engine rumbled to life, and the workers gathered around in anticipation, watching as the massive machine slowly inched closer to the statue. It was their last hope. After hours of struggling, the crane was the only tool powerful enough to lift the statue from its resting place. Tina stood at the edge of the clearing, watching the scene unfold. There was a strange sensation in the air, almost like the forest itself was watching, waiting. She shook her head, trying to dismiss the uneasy feeling creeping up her spine. The day had already been long and frustrating, but now, with the crane about to lift the statue, everything was about to change. Marco, standing beside her, glanced over at her, noticing the tension in her posture. "You okay?" he asked, his voice low. Tina nodded quickly, though her mind was far from calm. "Yeah, just a bit. Uneasy, I don't know why." Marco raised an eyebrow but said nothing. The crane was now mere inches from the statue, its arm reaching out like a mechanical hand prepared to grip the stone. The workers held their breath, their eyes fixed on the machine. The operator, a man named Rick, carefully maneuvered the controls. With a steady hand, he extended the crane's claw, positioning it over the top of the statue. It was an impressive machine, capable of lifting hundreds of tons with ease. The workers had no doubt that this would finally solve the problem. But as the claw descended toward the statue, a subtle but strange change in the atmosphere made everyone pause. It wasn't something anyone could explain right away, but it was there. A slight vibration in the ground, a hum in the air. The leaves in the trees rustled even though there was no wind. The birds, which had been silent earlier, were now completely still. The air itself felt heavy, thick, almost charged with energy. The workers exchanged uneasy glances, their nervousness growing. Tina couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. She glanced at the crane again, but this time she felt a strange discomfort. The closer the claw got to the statue, the more intense the sensation became. It was as if the statue was reacting to the crane's presence, but how could that be possible? It was just an old piece of stone. Rick, the operator, glanced back over his shoulder at the workers. "It's going to take a little more precision," he said, adjusting the controls again. The claw moved ever closer, hovering just above the statue. The workers, though nervous, were still hopeful. Then, something unexpected happened. The moment the crane's claw made contact with the statue, a low, almost inaudible rumble began. It started as a gentle vibration beneath their feet, but quickly intensified. The workers looked around, bewildered. The ground seemed to tremble, as if something deep below was awakening. The trees swayed, their branches creaking with a sound that was not caused by the wind. The air grew unnaturally still, and the only sound was the increasingly heavy hum that filled the forest. Tina took a step back, her heart racing. "What's happening?" she muttered, her voice barely above a whisper. The workers all turned toward each other, unsure of how to respond. Marco stepped forward, feeling the ground beneath him shift. "Is it the crane, the machine?" he suggested, though his voice held more uncertainty than certainty. But no one had the chance to respond. The moment the statue began to rise, the rumble grew louder, almost deafening. It wasn't just the statue being moved. It was as if the entire forest had responded to the movement. The trees creaked and groaned, their massive trunks shifting slightly as if they were reacting to the sudden disturbance. Tina's heart pounded in her chest. "It's not just the machine," she said, a hint of panic creeping into her voice. It's something else." The workers stood frozen, not sure whether to stay or run. Marco took a few tentative steps back, his eyes scanning the surroundings. The ground beneath them shook again, more forcefully this time, and the hum grew louder like an approaching storm. And then the trees began to sway. It wasn't the wind. The forest, which had been still and quiet, now moved as if alive. The workers could see the branches shaking violently, and some of the larger trees groaned, their roots shifting. It was as if the forest itself was trying to fight the movement of the statue. Tina felt a strange pressure in her chest, as though the very air was thickening around her. "Stop! Stop the crane!" she shouted, her voice trembling with fear. She looked up at Rick, who seemed just as alarmed as the rest of them, but before he could respond, something incredible happened. The crane's arm stopped moving, frozen in midair, as if some invisible force had gripped it. Rick tried to restart the machine, but it was no use. The crane's engine sputtered and then fell silent. The workers stared wide-eyed, unable to believe what they were seeing. The machine, usually so powerful and reliable, had just stopped. Tina stepped back, clutching her arms tightly. "What the hell is going on?" she whispered. The ground shook again, more violently this time. It was as if the earth beneath their feet was alive, reacting to the statue's movement. The trees around them seemed to bend and stretch, their branches creaking louder, like they were whispering something just out of earshot. The sound grew louder with each passing moment, and the workers felt a sense of dread rising within them. Suddenly, a low, distant sound echoed through the forest. It wasn't a voice, but a strange, almost musical hum coming from deep within the earth. The workers stood frozen, staring at each other in shock. "Did you hear that?" Marco asked, his voice barely audible. Tina nodded slowly. "It's coming from below the ground." Before anyone could react, a figure appeared from the shadows at the edge of the clearing, an authority figure dressed in a dark uniform. He moved quickly, his eyes scanning the scene. "Stop everything," he ordered, his voice commanding. "No one is to touch the statue again." The workers turned toward him, confusion written on their faces. "But we need to move it. It's part of the plan," Marco protested, his voice edged with frustration. The man shook his head firmly. "This area is now under lockdown. No one is allowed to interfere with the statue any longer. You've disturbed something that should not be moved." Tina's heart skipped a beat. What did he mean? The statue wasn't just a relic. It was something far more important than they had realized. The authorities moved quickly to set up a perimeter around the statue, urging the workers to step back. But it was clear, this was no longer just a job. It was something far greater. Something no one had prepared for. The forest was silent, except for the occasional creak of the trees, their branches still swaying as though the wind had suddenly forgotten how to blow. Tina and the rest of the workers stood in stunned silence, watching the authorities begin to cordon off the area around the statue. They had no idea what had just happened or why the crane had stopped working, but they knew one thing for sure. This was no ordinary job. They had accidentally stumbled upon something that had been hidden away for centuries, and now the forest itself seemed to be reacting to their presence. The man in the dark uniform, the one who had commanded them to stop, was now speaking with Rick, the crane operator, and a few other officials who had arrived just moments earlier. Their voices were low and serious, their words unintelligible to the workers, but the urgency in their tone made it clear that they were discussing something much more important than just moving an old statue. Tina could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her. She had been involved in a lot of projects over the years, but nothing like this. Nothing had ever made her feel this uneasy. She could still feel the tremor in the ground, still hear the hum in the air. It was like the forest itself was alive, watching, waiting. She glanced at Marco, who was standing nearby, his arms crossed over his chest, his brow furrowed in confusion. "What do you think they're talking about?" he asked quietly, his voice barely rising above the sound of the rustling leaves. Tina didn't answer right away. She wasn't sure what to think. She was used to things going wrong on jobs, but this felt different. Something had happened when the crane had touched the statue. The vibration in the ground, the strange hum, they weren't just coincidences. There was something about that statue, something that had been hidden for a reason, and now it was reacting to being disturbed. The man in the uniform turned toward the workers, his expression stern. "You need to leave the area," he said firmly. "This site is now under investigation. No one is allowed near the statue until further notice." The workers exchanged looks of disbelief. "What do you mean, under investigation?" Marco asked. "We were just moving the statue. There's nothing wrong with it." The man's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, Tina could see a flicker of something dark behind his gaze. "You don't understand. This statue isn't what you think it is. It's been here for centuries, and moving it has disturbed something much older than any of us. We need to secure the area immediately." The words sent a chill down Tina's spine. "What do you mean, disturbed something older than us?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "What's so special about this statue?" The man didn't answer directly. Instead, he turned to one of the other officials, speaking to him in rapid, urgent whispers. The official nodded and then began setting up more barriers around the clearing. The rest of the workers were herded back, instructed to leave the site and head toward the nearby town. No one seemed to know what was going on, but it was clear that this was no ordinary situation. As Tina and the others were escorted away from the site, she couldn't shake the feeling that they had crossed a line, one they shouldn't have crossed. The statue, which had once seemed like just another piece of history, now felt like something much more dangerous. There was an energy about it, something that had been lying dormant for centuries, waiting for the right moment to awaken. But why? Why had it responded to the crane? And why had the authorities acted so quickly? The workers were led back to their trucks, their minds racing with questions. No one said much during the walk back, the weight of the situation hanging heavily in the air. The once peaceful and quiet forest now felt like a place of mystery, something untouchable, a place that had secrets buried deep within its soil. Tina could feel the unease settle into her stomach, the questions spinning faster than her mind could handle. They arrived back at the town by late afternoon, but there was no sense of relief. No one felt like they were leaving something behind. It felt as though they had entered a new world, one where everything had changed in an instant. As they unloaded their gear from the trucks, Tina overheard a conversation between a few of the workers. They were talking about the strange sensation they had felt, the hum in the air, the tremors in the ground. Everyone who had been there felt it. It was as if the forest had rejected them, as if something had been disturbed that should never have been disturbed. Tina couldn't help but wonder if they had just triggered something that had been meant to stay buried forever. Later that night, Tina couldn't sleep. She tossed and turned in her bed, her mind replaying the events of the day over and over again. What had really happened? What had the statue been hiding? Why did the authorities act so quickly to shut the area down? She tried to push the thoughts out of her mind, but they kept coming back, louder and clearer with each passing moment. Unable to sleep, she decided to take a walk through the quiet town. The streets were empty, the shops closed, and the only sound was the soft rustle of leaves in the breeze. She walked aimlessly, her thoughts swirling. It was then that she saw the lights flickering in the distance, far beyond the edge of town. It was the forest. Her heart skipped a beat. She had already been told to stay away from the site, but something inside her pulled her toward it. There was something calling her, something that drew her back to the forest. The feeling was strange, almost like a whisper on the wind, something that she couldn't ignore. Without fully understanding why, Tina found herself walking toward the forest again, her feet moving faster than her mind could keep up with. The path was dark, but she didn't feel afraid. It was as if the forest itself was drawing her in. She didn't know what she would find, but she knew that she had to see the statue again. As she reached the edge of the forest, the ground beneath her feet felt different, warmer somehow, as if the earth was alive. She paused, her breath catching in her throat, but then something incredible happened. The trees seemed to part, almost as if they were making way for her. The clearing where the statue had once stood was visible in the distance, bathed in an eerie, unnatural light. Tina could barely believe her eyes. She had thought the area was secured. The authorities had said it was off-limits, but now it seemed as though the forest itself had allowed her to enter. She stepped forward cautiously, her heart pounding in her chest. The light ahead grew brighter, and the humming sound she had heard earlier seemed to grow louder, vibrating through the very air around her. The forest was alive, and she was at its heart. What had she awakened? The clearing ahead was bathed in an eerie glow, and Tina's heart raced as she stepped closer. The trees seemed to move aside as if making way for her, and the hum, that strange, vibrating sound, echoed in her ears. She had never felt this way before. a mixture of fear and curiosity pulling her forward, urging her to discover what lay ahead. The forest, which had once seemed calm and peaceful, now felt alive, watching her every move. As Tina approached the statue, she could see that it was no longer the same as it had been earlier in the day. The stone surface, which had been worn and weathered, now seemed to pulse with an inner light. The carvings that had once been barely visible were now clear, glowing faintly with an otherworldly energy. It was as if the statue itself had awakened, responding to the disturbance that had occurred earlier when the crane had tried to lift it. Tina stood frozen for a moment, mesmerized by the sight. She could feel the air around her thickening, the energy in the forest growing stronger with each passing second. The hum in the air was louder now, almost like a low-frequency vibration that she could feel deep in her bones. It was as if the forest itself was alive, and she had disturbed something ancient, something that had been hidden for a reason. A sudden movement caught her eye. Just beyond the statue, a figure appeared from the shadows. It was tall and cloaked in darkness, but Tina could make out the shape of a man. He stood motionless for a moment, watching her as if he had been waiting for her arrival. His eyes, though obscured by the shadows of his hood, seemed to glow with a strange intensity. "Who are you?" Tina asked, her voice barely above a whisper. She didn't know why, but the question felt necessary, like she needed to know who this person was and what they knew about the statue. The man stepped forward, his movements smooth and deliberate. "I am the keeper of this place," he said, his voice low and steady. "And you have disturbed something that should not be disturbed." Tina's heart skipped a beat. "Disturbed?" she repeated, feeling the weight of his words. "We were just trying to move the statue. We didn't know." "You didn't know," the man interrupted, his voice sharp now. "But you should have. The statue is not just a relic. It is a guardian, a protector of this forest. It has stood here for centuries, keeping something buried deep beneath the earth. When you tried to move it, you broke the seal." Tina felt a chill run down her spine. "A seal?" she asked, her mind struggling to process his words. "What kind of seal?" The man stepped closer, his figure slowly becoming clearer in the light. "The forest is ancient, older than you can imagine. There are forces here that have been kept hidden for centuries. Forces that should never be disturbed, and now that you've awakened them, it will be too late to stop what comes next." Tina took a step back, her mind racing. "What are you talking about? What's coming?" The man's eyes flickered with a mixture of sadness and regret. "You'll see soon enough," he said softly. "The forest has been disturbed, and now it will demand what it has been owed." Tina's mind was spinning. She had thought they were just moving an old statue, something that had no real significance. But now, standing before this mysterious figure, she realized that they had unintentionally unleashed something much greater than they could have ever imagined. The statue, the forest, it was all connected to something far older and more powerful than anything she had ever known. Before she could speak again, the man turned and walked back into the shadows, his figure vanishing as quickly as it had appeared. Tina stood there for a moment, staring at the spot where he had been, her thoughts a blur. What had he meant? What was this seal he had mentioned? And what had they awakened in the forest? The ground beneath her feet suddenly trembled, a deep vibration that seemed to come from the very heart of the earth. Tina's breath caught in her throat as the hum around her grew louder, more intense. The trees swayed again, this time in a way that was almost unnatural, as if they were being pushed by an unseen force. The air felt charged with energy, and she could feel the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. And then in the distance she saw it, a bright light flashing from the ground beneath the statue. It was as if something deep below was stirring, something that had been waiting for this moment. The light pulsed, growing brighter with each passing second, until it seemed to fill the entire clearing. Tina stepped back, her mind screaming at her to run, but her feet were frozen to the ground. She couldn't look away. The light was mesmerizing, drawing her in, pulling her closer to the source of the disturbance. It was like a magnetic force, something that she couldn't resist, even if she wanted to. Suddenly, the ground shook violently beneath her. The trees around her groaned and cracked, and she heard something. No, someone calling her name. It was a low, echoing voice, but it wasn't human. It was deep, resonating with a power that made her chest feel tight. "Tina," the voice called again, and this time it sounded closer, like it was coming from inside her mind. She stumbled backward, her heart racing. The trees began to move, their trunks twisting and bending unnaturally. The light from the statue grew blinding, and Tina could feel the ground beneath her feet shift, as if the earth itself was opening up. "Stop!" Tina cried, her voice trembling with fear. But the light only grew brighter and the tremors in the ground became stronger. It was then that Tina realized something terrifying. The forest wasn't just reacting to the statue. It was reacting to her. The statue had been a guardian, holding something back. But now, with the seal broken, it seemed that whatever was hidden in the depths of the earth was beginning to rise. The forest was alive, and it was angry. Tina had awakened something, and now the forest was coming for her. Tina turned and ran, her breath coming in gasps as she sprinted back toward the town. The ground shook beneath her with every step, and the trees seemed to reach out as if trying to grab her. She didn't dare look back. She could hear the voice calling her name, growing louder, but she didn't want to know what it was. She had to get out of the forest, away from the statue, away from whatever was about to be unleashed. But as she ran, the light continued to pulse behind her, and the feeling of being watched grew stronger. The forest was alive, and it wasn't going to let her go. Tina ran through the forest with her heart pounding, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps. The ground beneath her feet trembled with each step she took, and the trees around her seemed to close in, their twisted branches reaching out like hands trying to grab her. She dared not look back, but she could still feel the pulse of light from the statue, blinding in its intensity. The voice, deep and echoing, still called her name, and each time she heard it, it sent a wave of fear through her body. She had never felt terror like this before, not even when she had first stepped into the forest earlier that day. Back then, everything had seemed so calm, so peaceful, but now everything had changed. The forest was alive, and it was no longer just a place to work or explore. It had become a living, breathing entity, reacting to what had been disturbed. Tina stumbled over a rock and caught herself, her hands scraping against the rough bark of a nearby tree. She didn't stop to check for injuries. She couldn't afford to. She had to get out of here back to safety, away from whatever had been awakened by the statue's removal. The trees seemed to close in around her, their branches twisting unnaturally. She could hear them creaking, almost like they were whispering, but the words were unintelligible. The hum in the air had grown louder, vibrating through her bones, and it felt like the entire forest was closing in on her, suffocating her. Every step she took seemed to be met with resistance, like the very earth beneath her feet was pushing back, unwilling to let her leave. Suddenly, she heard a sharp crack behind her and the sound of something, or someone, moving through the underbrush. Tina's eyes widened in panic. She couldn't see anything, but she could feel the presence of something chasing her. The air around her grew colder, and she could feel the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. Whatever was in the forest wasn't just watching her anymore, it was hunting her. Her legs burned with exhaustion, but she pushed herself harder, her feet slipping on the damp ground as she navigated through the trees. She had to keep moving, had to find a way out. The path she had taken earlier was no longer visible. The forest had changed. The familiar landmarks she had passed before were now hidden by shadows and thick underbrush. It was like the forest was shifting, rearranging itself to trap her in its depths. She reached a clearing and stopped to catch her breath, leaning against a tree. Her chest heaved with the effort, and her heart was still racing. She tried to steady her breath, but the sound of it echoed in the stillness of the forest, adding to her growing sense of panic. She was alone in the middle of the woods, and it felt as though the very trees themselves were closing in on her. Then she heard it again, the voice, low and resonant, calling her name. It was louder now, almost as if it were right behind her. She spun around, but there was no one there. The clearing was empty, the forest silent once more. Tina's heart pounded in her chest, the fear gripping her tightly. What was happening? Who or what was calling her? As if in answer to her thoughts, the ground beneath her began to tremble again, more violently than before. The trees around her shook, their branches swaying as if they were alive, reaching for her. The earth beneath her feet cracked and split open, sending a chill of terror through her spine. From the cracks in the ground, a dark mist began to rise, swirling in the air like smoke. Tina gasped, stepping back in fear. The mist seemed to move toward her, swirling faster, almost as if it had a mind of its own. She tried to run, but the mist was already surrounding her, enveloping her in its cold embrace. The air grew thick and heavy, and she could barely breathe. The voice was now a constant presence in her mind, whispering words she couldn't understand. The light from the statue still pulsed in the distance, brighter than ever, and Tina felt drawn to it. She didn't know why, but she knew she had to go back. The statue held the answers, the key to stopping whatever had been unleashed. The forest had already changed, and there was no escaping it now. She had to face what had been awakened. With determination, Tina pushed through the mist, forcing her legs to move despite the heavy air. She ran back toward the clearing, the voice growing louder in her mind. The earth continued to shake, and the trees around her bent and twisted in unnatural ways. It was as though the forest itself was alive, and it was angry, rejecting her presence. As she reached the edge of the clearing, the sight before her stopped her dead in her tracks. The statue, once still and silent, was now glowing brighter than ever. Its stone surface shimmered with an eerie light, and the carvings etched into it were alive, shifting and changing before her eyes. It was as if the statue itself was transforming, becoming something more than just stone. It was becoming something else. The dark mist that had surrounded Tina seemed to dissipate as she approached, but the air remained thick with tension. The statue's energy felt almost tangible now, and Tina could feel it pulling her closer. She stepped forward cautiously, unsure of what was happening. She felt as if she were being drawn into the very heart of the forest, into the power that had been sealed away for so long. The earth shook again, and Tina stumbled, her foot catching on a root. She fell to her knees, her hands scraping against the dirt. She looked up at the statue, and for the first time she felt truly afraid. This wasn't just an ancient relic. This was a guardian, a force of nature that had been waiting, hidden until the moment when it would be awakened. And now that moment had come. From deep within the statue, a low, rumbling sound echoed. The ground beneath Tina's hands trembled, and the air around her grew colder, almost icy. She could feel the power of the forest building, the energy rising from the earth like a storm gathering strength. It was as though the very land itself was preparing for something she couldn't yet understand. Then, from the depths of the statue, a brilliant light erupted, blinding her. She cried out in surprise, shielding her eyes from the intensity of it. The light seemed to pulse, growing stronger with each beat, until it was all she could see. The forest was alive, the statue was alive, and now, the power that had been dormant for centuries was being unleashed. Tina closed her eyes, her heart racing. She had no idea what was happening, but she knew one thing for sure. The forest had changed, and so had she. She had awakened something that had been lying in wait for a long, long time, and now there was no turning back. The light continued to pulse, and the world around her seemed to shift and change. Tina had no idea what the future held, but she knew she was part of something much bigger now. The forest had claimed her, and whatever was coming next, she would face it, for better or for worse.